Before I took this job on, I looked all over the place to try to find some information as to how to get the manifold off, and I really couldn't find anything anywhere. If I would have known where all the connections were, it would have made a big difference to how quickly I could get this thing off. The first thing you'll want to remove are the air boxes themselves. Now the air boxes are held in quite simply with 4 hose clamps. Here they are. Now these are kind of tricky. They snap in over themselves. But if you can just press them with a set of pliers, they will unhook and pop open. I struggled with mine a little bit. What I ended up doing was I was able to wiggle off the hoses very, very carefully and then pop the clamps off and disassemble them at that time. Then once the 4 hoses are off of the throttle bodies, the next step is to actually get the air boxes off. Now again, with all the panels and everything removed in the engine compartment, what you do is each air box is held in with 3 screws. Just 1, 2, and 3. And these are 4 millimeter, or you use a 4 millimeter Allen wrench on them. And just this is a hex head Allen wrench. You put them on, take them off, and then these airbox lids will flip upwards this way a little bit, and you can pull them out. And then when the airbox lids are out, you then can pop the filters off. I guess the previous owner at some stage, or one of the previous owners of this car, put some K&N filters in, and they look pretty clean, so it's nice to see that the car's been well cared for in the past. Now, as I said, first step here is get both air boxes off, and it makes a really big difference to the amount of space that you have when you're working on the car. So here's the goal of what we're trying to do in this video. We're trying to get this big intake manifold off of the engine. Now, believe it or not, this entire intake manifold is actually held in with 3 bolts. So if you have a look, these are the bolts. Now the bolts are, these mounts over here are the ones that actually stick up between the V of the engine and hold the carbon fiber trim in place, and the center one is a 3rd one. So when you had a look at the intro of this video, there was a picture of the engine being worked on with the intake manifold off, and there were 3 big studs sticking out of it. And these ones actually pass, if you take a look at the intake manifold over here, there are 3 holes. There's one right over here, one in the middle, and one a little further forwards. And once you remove these 2 long studs and this nut, it's a 13 millimeter wrench to take them off, that is really what holds everything in place and allows the manifold to come off. Now, of course, there's a lot of hoses and other connections there as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at every side of this intake manifold and look at precisely what needs to be removed in order to get it off the car. So let's look at all 4 sides of this manifold and look at exactly the connections that are required so that you only remove what is necessary in order to get the manifold off. So just for a point of orientation, looking at the manifold like this would be the back of the car and that would be the front of the car. So naturally the passenger side is towards us and the driver's side, at least in North America, is away from us. So if we look at this side, there isn't a lot of connections that need to be taken off, but there are a few. This is a large hose. It's a breather hose or a vacuum hose that needs to be taken off. Just with a hose clamp it comes off. And then down here there is 1 and 2 little hoses. You can just see it right there. This 1 and 2 over here. Those need to be disconnected. The connections to all of this over here where you see the red and the blue, those don't need to be touched. Outside of that, so those are the hose connections, but outside of that there are 2 electrical connections, 1 for each throttle body. So remember, the air boxes are out and you're going to have access underneath. There's going to be 1 connection over here. So it's just a slide connector where you pull it off, and over to the next throttle body, again underneath here, slide connector, you press, it'll move a little clip out of the way, and then you just slide it off. So that is the passenger side of the intake manifold. Moving on to the driver's side, there are some similar connections to deal with over here. If we get in close as well, you have the same big tube that was there before on the other side. There is a little tiny one over here and a small one over here, exactly like the other side. The only difference is that the driver's side has an additional small tube that needs to be pulled off right over here. And again, just like the passenger side, there is 1 and 2 connectors that need to be pulled out and disconnect the throttle bodies. Now we are on to the back side of the engine. When looking at the driver's side, we saw that there was this really big connector over here. Now this connector actually gives you almost all of the electrical connections that go to the intake manifold, and they're all in one place. I'll show it in a minute where it disconnects on the car, but to actually get it off the car, you actually slide this in this direction. You'll see that there is like a tab with a dot on it. It slides in this direction. And as this gray part slides away, it will physically pull the connector out. So it has like a cam locking mechanism in there that does that for you. So that's kind of cool. But this connector needs to be removed, and we're going to go to the car and have a look at exactly where that is located. So here we are in the engine compartment. And again, this is the driver's side over here. You're familiar where the main power shutoff is, and over here is where that connector is. Now that connector runs, the wire will run over here, possibly underneath this steel tube. It'll run along here inside this clip, and then it will make a turn and go towards the engine. Now in my particular case, this additional bracket needed to be moved out of the way to allow the cable a good passage out of the car. So I suggest that you make sure that the passage is good on your car and that the cable is good and out of the way before you try lifting the manifold out of the engine bay. Coming back to the back side here of the intake manifold, we have a few other disconnections that need to be made. If you come down here, you'll see that there are 2 sensors with little blue ends on them, and those need to be pulled out. To get them out, you actually depress them. You can see that this metal pin kind of moves through there, and then that allows you then to pull them out. And then the other thing that there is there are 2, well, I really don't know what they are, but they look like sensors, or they have a wire connection. Now these 2 seem to be the same left and right. So just to be sure, I labeled 1A, 1B, same thing on the wires. And again, there's a connector where you just pull them out from underneath, and then you're good to go. And lastly, the last thing that needs to get disconnected is the fuel rail. Now there are 2 fuel lines that come over here, and it is very, very important to put 1 wrench on this dark part and then 1 wrench on the actual fitting itself, so that you're holding it nice and steady and you can break them free. If I remember correctly, I think this was a 17 millimeter and the other one was a 19 millimeter. So pretty standard wrenches that should be in any toolbox. Lastly, here is the firewall side. So this is the front part of the engine, the part that goes up essentially facing the front part of the car. Now, over here on the passenger side, there are 2 hoses. One has blue connectors going to it, the other one has red connectors going to it. And there are hoses that plug into here. And if you take a look on the car itself, one is labeled blue, one is labeled red, so it's all pretty self-explanatory. Again, there's a fuel rail back here, and you'll want to be able to hold it in with your 17 millimeter wrench, come with a 19 millimeter wrench and break it free. Another thing to consider as well is when you're taking apart these fuel fittings, you'll always want to have a rag underneath, because a little bit of fuel will dribble out. And ideally, you'll want to have something to plug the end of the hose. I had some silicone type conical plugs I just put in the end of the hoses, and allowed me to just keep having the hoses from dribbling out any fuel. Now, this one is the kicker. This is the one that you don't know about anywhere unless you learn about it the hard way. And amazingly, there is one more electrical connector here, and it comes off of the front side of the manifold. It falls deep into the crevices of nowhere, and actually it connects to the side of the transmission. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look underneath the car, and I'm going to show you exactly where this connector actually connects. Here we are under the car, and we had looked at that one connector that was giving us a hard time to get the intake manifold off. Well, if you have a look moving forwards, that connector is right over here. So if you know to disconnect it, you just come underneath the car, disconnect it, and then the entire intake manifold can now be lifted out. You've removed everything that you need to. And here's the final product. As you can see, the intake manifold has been removed. And actually, when you're removing the intake manifold, it's good to have two people. It's probably impossible to do it with one person. So you want to have two people, one on each side, and they reach on either side of the car, lift the manifold up, there's plenty of room for it, and then bring it out towards the back of the car. You'll also notice on this particular car, I've protected the paint in a few spots using some foam mats, and actually I use yoga mats. They're great because they're thin, they're a little on the sticky side, they protect the paint very, very well, but they're not too bulky and not too unwieldy. Sometimes using things like towels or blankets can be a little bit difficult to work with. Looking a little bit closer, you'll see that at this stage I've already disconnected the coil packs and removed them. But it's not necessary to do that in order to get the intake manifold off. You can also see here the 3 studs that I spoke about earlier that are the ones that hold the intake manifold in place. And just for curiosity's sake, you'll see that the intake manifold seals to the head using rubber O-rings. And I've put some blue paper towels into the openings to protect anything from falling in. When you do this kind of work, you always want to be super careful to make sure that nothing can fall in to the engine and cause a catastrophic problem. I hope you enjoyed this guide that shows how to remove the intake manifold on a Lamborghini Murcielago engine. And at the moment, as you can see, the intake manifold is a little on the dirty side from some accumulated grime over many years, and we'll be giving it a nice cleaning and detailing before it finds its way back into the engine.